stripped of its bizarre excesses, Dr. Cameron's experiments, building upon Dr. Hebb's earlier breakthrough, laid the scientific foundation for the CIA's two-stage psychological torture method. Years before he ever received his first grant from a CIA cutout fund, D. Ewan Cameron had been conducting experiments that caused his patients discomfort and suffering. In 1931, he published his investigation of the dehydration method of treatment in epilepsy in the American Journal of Psychiatry. He prescribed, as he described it, a diet of low water content. This amounted to as little as 600 milliliters of water a day, supplemented by diuretics to increase the percentage of fluid excreted. The results of this experiment are haunting. From the first week or so, the patient stole or attempted to steal food or drink on every opportunity. They took snow from the window ledges, water from flower vases, and food from other patients' trays. One patient even died during the experiment. Sudden collapse and death followed. The post-mortem report stated that the heart and kidneys were small, the stomach mucous membrane degenerated with complete destruction in places. Blood vessels were congested, and there were areas of hemorrhage. In conclusion, this method would appear to be of little value. In 1943, Cameron established his research laboratory in the Ravenscrag Mansion on the slopes of Mount Royal. The new Allen Memorial Institute, originally the home of a shipping magnate of the same name, was featured glowingly in The Modern Hospital. As observed by Rebecca Lemov, a professor of the history of science at Harvard, the pages of Modern Hospital and like publications hailed Cameron as a humane innovator, his facility leading the way for the world as a whole. By 1952, Cameron was a prominent psychiatrist, and that year he'd become president of the American Psychiatric Association, a title he'd hold until 1953. In February of that year, Cameron attended the 5th annual neuropsychiatric meeting in Arkansas, where he gave his paper, The Transition Neurosis, where Cameron exposes perhaps some ideological underpinnings in his work. Regarding the extraordinary political conversions which we have seen, particularly in the Iron Curtain countries, the stress required to bring this about, at least as far as the political conversions are concerned, is capable of being developed only behind the Iron Curtain. We have explored this procedure in one case using sleeplessness, disinhibiting agents, and hypnosis. Years later, Sid Gottlieb would be asked to answer for Cameron's treatments by a lawyer representing his former patients. So you were interested in trying to determine what had happened to brainwashing victims, and this research bore upon that question? Gottlieb answered, I mentioned brainwashing victims in the sense of people who seem to have their very fundamental ideas and behavioral change come out of Korea, Red China, and some changes in behavior of diplomats that were returning from behind the Iron Curtain. The year before his first agency grant, in 1956, Cameron introduced his psychic driving method in the American Journal of Psychiatry. Reportedly inspired by the Dormophone, a phonograph and pillow speakers marketed as a way to learn while sleeping, Cameron's version would play excerpts of taped therapy sessions. In January 1957, Cameron's first grant application was received by the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, one of many MKUltra funding conduits. Harvey M. Weinstein wrote extensively of Cameron in his Psychiatry and the CIA, Victims of Mind Control. Victims that include his own father, Lewis, a patient at the Allen Memorial Institute. He explains that CIA psychologist John Gittinger came across Cameron's article on psychic driving and suggested the agency contact the psychiatrist. The agency were doubtless intrigued with the breaking down of defenses analogous to the breakdown of the individual under continuous interrogation that Cameron claimed to bring about. That same year, writes Weinstein, Maitland Baldwin, a CIA-funded researcher in sensory deprivation, visited Cameron in Montreal to discuss isolation techniques, and 3 months later, a grant application was received by the Society from the Allen Memorial Institute. His application included his plan of breaking down of ongoing patterns of the patient's behavior by means of particularly intensive electroshocks, which he called depatterning. followed by psychic driving, sensory deprivation, and continuous sleep. A year after his first grant, while the CIA was funding Cameron's research to the tune of some $20,000 a year, he co-authored a study in the Canadian Medical Association journal on his depatterning method, ostensibly a treatment for schizophrenia. This method consists essentially in the use of prolonged sleep lasting 30 to 60 days combined with intensive electroshock therapy. 26 schizophrenic patients would receive this treatment. The patient sleeps an average of 20 to 22 hours a day and is wakened 3 times a day for meals and toilet. Patients were pummeled into deep sleep using chlorpromazine and several barbiturates. Posturing of the patients by the nurses is carried out every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. After 10 days of this comatose slumber, electroshock begins. The objective of the electroshock therapy is to produce in combination with sleep a condition of confusion, which we term complete depatterning. This battery of drugs and electroshock will render the patient very confused. He asks, "Where am I? How did I get here? And what is this place?" At the advanced stage of the treatment, the patient does not recognize anyone, has no idea where he is, and is not troubled by that fact. He usually shows urinary incontinence and has difficulty in performing quite simple motor skills. Cameron is pleased with this result, as the subject's delusional ideas are completely absent, as are all other evidences of his schizophrenic behavior. Consider the fact that Cameron's work was far from secret. Indeed, his studies were published in a number of prestigious medical journals. Additionally, Cameron was a renowned figure in the world of psychiatry. In 1961, he'd become president of the World Psychiatric Association. These facts can only testify to the realities of medical practice during this grim period of science. Further evidenced by his 1962 study of depatterning, again, ostensibly a treatment for schizophrenia. A survey of the existing literature showed that of the multiplicity of methods of treatment, massive electroshock seemed promising. In its original form, the method consisted essentially of the administration of 2 to 4 electroshocks daily to the point where the patient developed an organic brain syndrome with acute confusion, disorientation, and interference with his learned habits of eating and bladder and bowel control. While in this condition, his schizophrenic symptoms disappeared. In favorable cases, the schizophrenic symptomatology would not reappear. I insist on mentioning here that Cameron cites a number of other doctors conducting similar research. Kennedy and Ansel described their patients as being brought to the level of 4-year-old children. Rothschild and his coworkers referred to certain of their organically disorganized patients as being unable to swallow, but able to suck fluid from a feeding bottle. Gluck reported that his patients were like helpless infants. They were incontinent in bladder and bowel and required spoon feeding as well as tube feeding. Cameron shares the results of his experiments, ranging from loss of a second language or all knowledge of his marital status. In more advanced forms, he may be unable to walk without support, to feed himself, and he may show double incontinence. At this stage, all schizophrenic symptomatology is absent. The year before, Cameron authored a study included in a symposium on psychophysiological aspects of spaceflight, funded by the U.S. Air Force. Its focus was a reduction in sensory input. His pursuit of a cure for schizophrenia is not apparent in this study, and in fact, it notes how another researcher compared sensory deprivation and schizophrenia and states that he feels that it produces the primary symptoms of schizophrenia. The research conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute included the following. Patients were in a darkened room with goggles, and their ears were covered with rubber eardrums into which was led white sound. White sound was also led into the room. The arms were covered with cardboard cylinders. The patients were fed and toileted in the rooms. The nurses had instructions to reduce all communication to a minimum, and the timing and composition of the subject's meals were changed unpredictably. Soup might be given for breakfast. The duration of stay in such sensory isolation was increased to a maximum of 16 days. The authors describe administering Cernil, a brand name for pharmaceutical PCP. With our psychoneurotic subjects, Cernil produced apathy, then anxiety, followed by disturbance of body image, feelings of unreality, and depersonalization. Further on, the electroshock therapy so favored by Cameron is applied not as a treatment for schizophrenia in this case, but merely as a foray into sensory deprivation. One can only imagine being placed in the conditions already described, in pitch blackness with goggles and cardboard tubes on your arms for days, along with the lack of physical and auditory input, now followed by massive electroshock to a point where marked degrees of confusion occur. At the point where electroshock is beginning to interfere with the maintenance of the space-time image, there occurs marked anxiety and often hostility. The authors call this complete depatterning. To their satisfaction, they conclude that a basic activity of all human beings is to maintain and extend control over their internal and external environments. Where this control is interfered with, anxiety constantly appears. A further conclusion, no doubt relevant to the men of the technical services staff at CIA, behavioral changes can be produced in adult human subjects by exposure to reduction in sensory input. They even list ways in which reduction in input can be achieved. Relevant information, again, not in the treatment of schizophrenia, but perhaps relevant to interrogation. Gordon Thomas provided an enlightening find in his Journey into Madness, an interview with Dr. Cameron from a 1955 issue of Weekend Magazine, a popular Canadian tabloid. The article dealt specifically with beneficial brainwashing, saying Dr. Cameron was credited with inventing a daring idea designed to help neurotic patients by using a modified form of brainwashing. Quoting Cameron, he had added he was confronted with the same problems as professional brainwashers because his patients, like prisoners of the communists, tended to resist and had to be broken down. A central problem with Cameron's claims of treating schizophrenia is the fact that patients of his were given depatterning, psychic driving, and sensory deprivation treatments without ever having been diagnosed with schizophrenia at all. In fact, some patients were simply anxious, perhaps in an unfortunate marriage, or suffering from postpartum depression. Cameron's patients were typically women. One dubious treatment involves a 28-year-old married woman admitted for the second time. Her first admission had been in May 1956, owing to a personality change. She claimed she often talked with God and occasionally with the Virgin Mary. Later, she became rather moody and ultimately, frankly, delusional. Unfortunately for the patient, she continued to believe the prophecy of a nun who had allegedly told her some years ago that her husband was to die during a foggy and misty period. In April 1959, she was extremely paranoid and would see significance in the way a book lay on a desk or a pencil was moved. She still continued treatment on an ambulant basis, but eventually had to be readmitted when she became quite unable to carry out her housework any longer, after which it was decided to depattern the patient. This story was included in a paper in which Cameron describes inducing amnesia through his depatterning, from a February 1960 issue of Comprehensive Psychology. The usual treatment plan employed is to put the patient on prolonged chemical sleep and immediately to start electroshock therapy. Some patients have been treated up to 65 days in continuous sleep. The average amount of ECT given is 20 to 30 electrical treatments, but a number of the patients have received considerably more than this. After this, there is complete amnesia for all events of his life. Patients were also given several counteracting drugs, including sodium amytal, a barbiturate, and digoxin, a brand name for methamphetamine. Similarly tragic is the case of one Mary C., her full name apparently a mystery. John Marks secured the doctor's notes from Mary's treatment from the APA archives. As Marks describes them, the aloof psychiatrist wrote in his notes, although the patient was prepared by both prolonged sensory isolation, 35 days, and by repeated depatterning, and although she received 101 days of positive driving, no favorable results were obtained. The 52-year-old Mary C. had apparently been diagnosed with the following: conversion reaction in a woman of the involutional age with mental anxiety, hypochondriac. In other words, Mary C. was going through menopause. Naomi Klein interviewed former patient Gail Katzner in her home. She was barely mobile, as violent convulsions from electroshocks had riddled her spine with small fractures. Gale's medical files tell a heartbreaking story, one as much about the limited choices available to an 18-year-old girl in the 50s as about governments and doctors abusing their power. She is a McGill nursing student, excelling in her studies, whom Cameron describes as a hitherto reasonably well-balanced individual. She is, however, suffering from anxiety, caused, Cameron plainly notes, by her abusive father. After several weeks of his regimen, Cameron himself noted, "The shock treatment turned the then 19-year-old honor student into a woman who sucked her thumb, talked like a baby, demanded to be fed from a bottle, and urinated on the floor." In the Journal of Mental Science, D. Ewan Cameron wrote specifically of his psychic driving. The treatment entailed alternating between negative signals and positive statements. A negative recording from a therapy session, played through pillow speakers or a helmet in some cases, may include, "Now that you have 2 children, you don't seem to be able to manage them and keep a good relationship with your husband. You are drifting apart. You don't go out together. You have not been able to keep him interested in you sexually." A positive statement, "Begin to assert yourself first in little things. You will then be free to be a wife and mother just like other women." It's little surprise that it was found that the individual, after undergoing repetition for quite brief periods, experiences increasing discomfort and seeks to move out of the area of exposure. In order to keep the patient under the particularly long periods, 20 to 30 days for 16 hours a day, found requisite to achieve maximal incorporation of our signals, it was necessary to develop specific means. These means had to ensure that he stayed in the area of repetition whilst he remained maximally receptive. For that, they'd use PCP and chlorpromazine. The PCP reportedly produces underactivity because of its effects on the motor system. The negative phase is carried out until the patient shows growing rejection of the statements. This usually takes about 10 days. The tape running from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. A pillow speaker is used. The positive phase is ordinarily carried on for another period of 10 days. We have attempted to intensify the effect of the negative phase by applying galvanic simulation, i.e. electrocution, to the leg, this being synchronized with the end of each negative repetition. Over a typical 20-day period, a patient would be forced to listen to these statements up to 500,000 times. To summarize, the authors write that this driving can bring about a personality change. Repetition is shown to be a powerful force in producing change by mechanisms other than those hitherto recognized. Leonard Rubenstein was Cameron's lab assistant, his salary apparently covered totally by CIA funds. Years after Cameron's death, and after the fallout from the Church Committee that exposed MKUltra to the eyes of the world, Rubenstein would be interviewed by the New York Times. In a story on the use of private institutions and hospitals, D. Ewan Cameron's Allen Memorial Institute was prominently featured. "It was directly related to brainwashing," he said about the project in a telephone interview. "They had investigated brainwashing among soldiers who had been in Korea. We in Montreal started to use some of these techniques, brainwashing patients instead of using drugs."